Hello and welcome to another episode of Ask the History Buff. I'm Lynette, your curious Canadian history buff. I'm not a degreed historian by any stretch of the imagination with letters behind my name, but I have researched more of our Canadian history than most people have. I'm always discovering new and interesting information, which really excites me. And that's why I call myself the Curious Canadian History Buff. When I read something about Canadian history that I do not understand, I Google people's names and events surrounding them to understand their impact on society. I follow rabbit trails to see if I could understand what made the influencer tick, what influenced his or her life, and why he or she did what he or she did. And also, what events allowed them to leave an impact? So, the influencers, the things that influenced them, and the events that they left behind that we now see as a legacy of that they've left. So, hopefully, you will be inspired to research something that you hear on Ask the History Buff. In fact, Christian listeners are encouraged to become Bereans by researching the information themselves. And if you find any information that will inform, educate, and inspire other listeners, then send in your nugget to info at christianrootscanada.org. And if you have questions about any aspect of our history, or questions based on something that you have heard on Ask the History Buff, then send your questions in to info at christianrootscanada.org. If we don't know the answer, we will either send you a link so that you can go to a trusted source of information, or we will research it ourselves and let you know. Just remember, we will be looking at the influencers, their influence, and the lasting effect of their influence on Canada. For example, let's look at the influencers of the change from Dominion Day to Canada Day. I think that we should revert to calling this day Dominion Day instead of Canada Day, and here's why. So this is my premise. July 1st should be once again recognized as Dominion Day. And why, would you ask? Because that was the name chosen by 33 Fathers of Confederation based on Psalm 72:8. He shall have dominion also from sea to sea. That is also our motto on our coat of arms. The motto reads in Latin, A mare usque ad mare, from sea to sea. It is engraved on the concrete over the east window of the Peace Tower. So, who were the influencers of that change? Sir, Sir Samuel Leonard Tilley was responsible, was one of the influencers for the choice of Dominion Day. And the change, the influences of the change included Prime Minister Pierre Elliott Trudeau, MP Hal Herbert, MP Walter Baker, MP Mark Rose, MP Cyril Lloyd, who was also the deputy speaker at the time. So those were the influencers. Just Google their names. Now, the influence, before we get to the change of the name, how the name got changed from Dominion Day to Canada Day, we need to go back a little bit in history and look at the influence of Judeo-Christianity on Canada. Okay? Now, in the 1600s, Canada initially was founded largely by Catholics and Protestants, and others who were greatly influenced by a worldview that was shaped because of some sort of religious environment. With the British conquest in 1759, there came waves of British, Scottish, and Irish immigrants. They brought with them Anglicanism, Presbyterianism, and Methodism. And they brought that to Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI, and Quebec and Ontario, which was considered Quebec at that time. Now, because of a robust Protestant foundation in the Atlantic British colonies, which were Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and PEI, that influenced the spiritual, moral, legal, educational, and judicial standards long before Confederation. Confederation happened in 1867. This is before 1759 that these Protestant foundations were laid down in what was called the colonies before they became provinces. After the American War of Independence in 1776, those who were loyal to Britain, they were called loyalists, they moved from upstate New York and from other areas in the US that's close to the Canadian border, and they found a home in Britain's newest colony, which at that time was just called Quebec, which included Quebec and Ontario. It was split later on into Quebec and Ontario. Those loyalists settled in Montreal and, excuse me, in the western part of that province called Quebec, which was eventually called this western part of the big new colony of Quebec. That western part was now called Upper Canada because of the way the water flowed from the Great Lakes into the St. Lawrence River. So this Upper Canada, which became Ontario, and Lower Canada, which was Quebec. So around the 1860s, events so influenced the British colonies that it catapulted them into action in the interest of self-preservation. They felt that their security and their very existence were threatened. So this is in 1776 was the American War of Independence, and around 1860s, some events, I'll tell you about in a little bit, those events influenced the British colonies of Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, PEI, and Upper and Lower Canada to get together because of the events, world events happening around them. The Atlantic colonies, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and PEI, plus the Canadian colonies, Upper and Lower Canada, they felt pressured to work together because of those changing world events. The actions that they took created events like the Charlottetown Conference, the Quebec Conference, and eventually the London Conference, which confirmed those events confirmed that they were stronger together than their individual parts. So they got together and had these conferences to discuss how they could create the conditions necessary for the great event called Confederation. And this involved many influencers, 33 fathers of Confederation. It involved many influencers, many actions, many other events surrounding it, which created the aspect of Canadian history which many unlearned Canadians appropriate to the beginning of Canada. Canada did not begin in 1867. Okay, Canada did not begin in 1867. The colonies came together to form a confederation because of the common enemies that they had. So they felt that they were stronger together than apart. Now, what were these events? So these four colonies, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Ontario, and Quebec, they had come together at a time when they were facing three major threats. And you can read about some of these on our website, www.christianrootscanada.org, about the purchase of Rupert's Land, and that would give you a broad overview of what was happening around that time. So the purchase of Rupert's Land, go read it. Anyways, the first thing, the first threat, major threat they were facing was American invasion. And at that time, we might think that that's very silly to have that thought right now. But at that time in history, Americans hated Britain. And they wanted to get Britain out of North America so that these colonies could be annexed to the US. And that's a whole other discussion of something called manifest destiny. So Google manifest destiny and you will understand what was happening. The sentiment largely in the US, the sentiment was governed by that doctrine of manifest destiny. Go read it afterwards. Okay, so that was the first threat, the threat of American invasion to kick Britain out of North America. The second threat was the Fenian invasion. And many of you probably are hearing about Fenians for the very first time. And what was that about? Well, Irish immigrants brought their Protestant Catholic conflict into North America, and they wanted to import it to these colonies before Confederation, and even just around Confederation. So read about the Fenians again. So that was the second threat. So the first threat was American invasion. They wanted to kick Britain out of North America. The second was the Fenian invasions. And the third thing, more important, was the fact that there was a civil war happening south of the border in 1865. That's just around the time of Confederation. And I think I left the fourth one out. The fourth one has to do with the first one that the Americans wanted to kick Britain out of North America and um, and get the colonies, annex the colonies, and that was the sale of Alaska. That also is on our website. Go read it. The sale of Alaska, which happened in 1866. So 1865, the Civil War is happening south of the border. 1866, the sale of Alaska. 1867, a Confederation. And with the Civil War happening in 1865 to 1866, 1867, I think, 1867, the issue was that our rail links were so inextricably bound with that of the US. They still are today. Read about the railways, you will be amazed at all the information that you will see in there about the railways, which would blow your mind. So there was the fact that the railway lines were inextricably linked with the US lines. That was going to make it easy for an invasion to just drive across the border with troops. Those were real and present dangers at the time. Those were real things that caused the colonies to say, let's get together, form a confederation so we can face these challenges together. So that was the basis of confederation. On July 1st, 1867, Canada became a self-governing dominion. It meant that ethical laws for governing of Canada were now in the hands of our own parliamentarians and not the British Parliament, which was happening before with when we were individual colonies. The British government made all the decisions about what happened here. Now the decisions were moved to our own parliamentarian, our own parliamentary system. So the laws of the land of Confederation, they were derived largely from the moral laws of the Bible, the Ten Commandments. Our laws are rooted and grounded in British common law. British common law defined the laws enshrined in the BNA Act. If you have never read the BNA Act, you should read the BNA Act. You will see all the systems of justice. The original BNA Act is available online. You will see all the systems of justice and fairness and righteousness that were laid out in the BNA Act. The influence of those laws were responsible for a Christian cultural outlook, which pervaded the collective thought and actions of our early forebears way into the early 1980s until Pierre Trudeau came on the scene. Prime Minister Pierre Trudeau ushered in the Charter of Rights. Now remember, Canada was a nation founded by those who held a Judeo-Christian worldview, in that a Christian ethos pervaded the nation. Before and after Confederation, and just after the war in 1945, Canada was still a Judeo-Christian nation where justice, righteousness, and equality before the law, which you can find in the Bible in Leviticus chapter 24, verse 22. Equality before the law is a biblical construct, it is a biblical doctrine. And those were the things that influenced the social fabric of the nation. Dominion Day commemorated the fact that four of Britain's North American colonies had banded together as one autonomous community within the British Empire with allegiance to the crown. That autonomous community was called the Dominion of Canada. So let's look at the beginning of the deconstruction of the Judeo-Christian worldview and ethics and how that came about. Dominion Day had been a federal holiday and celebrated the enactment of the British North American Act, which united four of Britain's colonies into a single country within the British Empire and named that country the Dominion of Canada. The anniversary of this date was celebrated from 1868 to 1982 for 114 years. It was celebrated as Dominion Day until 1982, after Pierre Trudeau's government introduced the Canadian Charter of Rights. I think it was April 1982. Go check it out. The very next year, 1983, July 1st became Canada Day. Now, how and why was the date changed from Dominion Day to Canada Day? So this is how it happened. If you were to search the internet, you will find the answer. A private member's bill in the House of Commons went through an uneventful procedure based on a small number of MPs, 13 out of a potential 282, 4.6% of the House of Commons in the chamber. 13 out of 282. And this is what the Ottawa Citizen reported. At 4 o'clock on Friday, July 9th, 1982, 3 months after the Charter of Rights, the House of Commons was almost empty. The 13 parliamentarians taking up space in the 282-seat chamber were, by most accounts, half asleep as they began private members' hour. But then, one of the more wakeful Liberals noticed the Tory MPs were slow to arrive in the chamber. Someone, exactly who has never been firmly identified, remembered Bill C-201. Look that up. A private member's bill from Hal Herbert, the Liberal MP from Vaudreuil. That had been gathering dust ever since it had received first reading in May of 1980. An act to amend the Holidays Act proposed to change the name of the July 1st national holiday from Dominion Day to Canada Day. The whole process took 5 minutes. Would you believe that? 5 minutes. The MPs celebrated by declaring an early end to session at 4:05 p.m. And this is what they said. It is only appropriate that in celebrating our new holiday called Canada Day, we should at least take a holiday of 55 minutes this afternoon. And that was said by the NDP MP Mark Rose. Now just imagine that. 33 fathers of Confederation spent hours debating and deciding on the name for this great nation. The British Parliament had to debate this issue. Queen Victoria got involved. She participated in the discussions and gave assent to calling this great nation the Dominion of Canada. And in 5 minutes, 5 minutes, 13 callous, uneducated, unprincipled politicians undid an important aspect of our rationale for Confederation. And I'll say that again. In 5 minutes, 13 callous, uneducated, unprincipled politicians undid an important aspect of our rationale for Confederation. So let's see what the Hansard record had to say. The Hansard, in case you don't know, is the documents of all the words, every single word that is spoken in the House of Commons, it is recorded in the Hansard. And the Hansard reads this way: Holidays Act, suggested replacement of Dominion Day by Canada Day. And then it continues. Mr. Hal Herbert from Vaudreuil moved that Bill C-201 to amend the Holidays Act be read the second time and referred to the Standing Committee on Labor, Manpower, and Immigration. So I'm going to dramatize for you the various voices. Mr. Deputy Speaker, it is the pleasure of this House to adopt this motion. Or is it the pleasure of this House to adopt this motion? And some honorable members said, agreed. Mr. Rose said, no, it. And he stopped there. He was interrupted. Mr. Deputy Speaker, those in favor, please say yay. Some honorable members, yay. Mr. Deputy Speaker, those opposed will please say nay. Mr. Rose, just this bill or what? Mr. Deputy Speaker says, in my opinion, the yeas have it. Mr. Baker from Nepean Carlton said, what is going on? Mr. Deputy Speaker said, I declare the... He was interrupted by Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith rose and he said, I rise on a point of order. Perhaps we could seek the unanimous consent of the House to see if this matter could be dealt with in a committee of the whole so that we could deal with all stages of this bill today, as it seems we are meeting with the approval of the House. Mr. Deputy Speaker says, I started to declare that this motion was carried. The honorable member's point of order is a little premature. The chair will now entertain the parliamentary secretary to the Privy Council, Mr. Smith, on his point of order. Mr. Smith says, Mr. Chair, perhaps we could see whether the House would be disposed to give unanimous consent to this bill being dealt with in committee of the whole today. 13 members, the entire House. Incredible. Mr. Deputy Speaker says, is there unanimous consent that the bill be considered in committee of the whole? Is the honorable member from Mission Port Moody, Mr. Rose, rising? Mr. Rose said, I am not rising, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Deputy Speaker says, is there unanimous consent? And some honorable members said, agreed. Motion agreed to. Bill read the second time, and House went into committee. Thereon, Mr. Francis in the chair, the chairman. Order. House in Committee of the Whole on Bill C-201, an act to amend the Holidays Act. Clause 1, agreed to. Preamble, agreed to. Title, agreed to. Bill reported, read the third time, and passed. Mr. Deputy Speaker, is it now agreed that we now proceed to another order of business? And Mr. Smith said, Mr. Speaker, perhaps there might be unanimous consent that the clock now read 5 o'clock. Some honorable members agreed. Do you know who these MPs were? Some have left lasting legacies. So I'd like you to Google them, Google their names to find out what their legacies were. Hal Herbert, he was a liberal. Walter Baker, a conservative, and those living in Ottawa will know Walter Baker's name. Mark Rose, NDP. Cyril Lloyd Francis, Liberal and Deputy Speaker. Now, 2024 marked the 157th anniversary of the founding of the Dominion of Canada. I think it's time to reinstate a historic precedent which lasted for 114 years, which was changed, it seemed, for no good reason. Perhaps, and this is my conjecture, perhaps it was to remove a term which pointed to a biblical reference in our motto from Scripture. I'm assuming. I have not seen any rationale at this point in time for changing the name of the day from Dominion Day to Canada Day. Now go to our website, www.christianrootscanada.org, and read about these various topics. The sale of Alaska, the purchase of Rupert's Land, Sir Samuel Leonard Tilley, who came up with, he was one of the fathers of Confederation, and he proposed a Dominion, the name for Dominion of Canada, which was accepted by 33 fathers of Confederation. And read up about the Fenians, if you can, and about the manifest destiny belief. You will probably be aghast. Anyhow, those were the things that affected the celebration of Dominion Day. He shall have dominion from sea to sea. A Mary, usque ad Mary. See you in the next podcast. Bye for now.